Well, let me kind of give you the short version of what's going on the battlefield. This will obviously be a little outdated by the time this posts in a few hours, but it gives you an idea of what's going on. There are three major thrusts. The Russians and the Belarusians. Belarus, by the way, no longer exists as a country. It has now been sublimated into Russia. Belarusian and Russian forces have poured south into Kiev. They're in the process of launching their fourth major assault on the city right now. There is a second push that is in the east, going into the city of Krakow. Krakow is a Russian ethnic population, Russian speaker city that has now been under regular shelling for the last 12 hours. The Russians apparently have gotten frustrated that they just couldn't just go in there and have everyone join them, so they're leveling it.
Yeah, it's awful.
And then there's a third front in the south where forces from Crimea and forces from the secessionist enclaves in the southeast are joining together at Mariupol. That'll provide a land bridge for Russian forces all the way to Crimea, and then they can push very hard for the commercial capital of Odessa. With the fog of war and everything, it's really hard to say who's going to be successful when, but I would expect that third front to be the most important one for the next few days. Mariupol can't hold out much longer, and after that, all the forces that were dedicated to that will be able to pour towards Odessa, and Odessa doesn't have nearly the capacity to resist that Kiev and Krakow have. So I can see Odessa falling within a week, and if that happens, the Ukrainians have lost their major port and their primary way of getting large amounts of material in and out of the country, whether that is wheat for export or weapons for the war. After that, the Russians will probably do a couple north-south thrusts to chop up what's left of the Ukrainian army, and then we segue into the really, really brutal chapter of this. Once the Ukrainian army is defanged, this becomes a partisan conflict, guerrillas. And there are 45 million people in Ukraine. Russia has not fought a battle on this scale since the Second World War, and they have never fought an occupation war like this, with the possible exception of Afghanistan. But in Afghanistan, you have your population centers, and then there's not a lot else.
Right.
It's desert. Here it's farmland. So Ukraine is a forest of small towns and fields, and fighting a partisan war, well, ask the Russians, because that's how they've defended themselves in the past. So this is going to be a million plus, probably 2 million plus Russian troop occupation in an attempt to pacify this country. And it is going to be long, and it's going to be brutal, and it's going to be bloody. Let me give you the Russian case. I mean, obviously, ethically and morally, there's nothing that the Russians are doing that is, beyond to be perfectly blunt, that argument's bullshit. Because the only way that the Russians can have the degree of security that they say they deserve is if they occupy and deny rights to a population that's larger than their own.
Right.
So the Russian position, which is not insane, is that Russia has been invaded dozens of times in its history. All of the invaders have come through the same 9 pathways, breaks in the mountains or between the ocean and a mountain range. And so the Russian position is we need to physically expand the footprint of our country until we reach those barriers and can plug those gateways. That is the only way we can be safe.
Right.
Well, not because it was a world power, although they don't mind that, but because the Soviet Union controlled all 9 of those gateways, because it controlled all of those territories.
Right.
But the Soviet Union, when it fell, only had 300 million people. Russia today only has 140 million. And all those other territories combined, that's over 200 million people.
Yeah.
So the only way Russia will stop, the only way that Russia will be satisfied is if they get it all, because they see that as the only way they can be safe. Today, no one, but Russian history is replete with examples.
Sure.
So they're not thinking about this moment. They're looking forward, because the Russian population is dying out. And if the Russians do not secure their beachheads, their gateways in the next few years, they will lose all military capacity to do so. And so the only thing that is worse from their point of view of doing nothing and just allowing time to take them over is if they try and fail. So if they move out, they get condemned, their economy crashes, and they still can't secure those gateways, then Russia ceases to exist less than a decade after that. You remember a few years ago when Trump was president, he went to the Koreans, the Japanese, and the Germans. They said, you need to increase what you're paying for us as compensation for the bases by a factor of 5. The Germans said flat out no, and we're still dealing with the fallout from that. One of the reasons why our response to Ukraine has been so limited is Trump destroyed a lot of the intellectual and diplomatic and even physical infrastructure that was necessary. The Koreans dickered over the price, and they're paying the price for that now. The Japanese tipped us. And so Japan is in with the United States almost as if it was American territory. And if this war had happened 5 years ago, Japan would not be participating in the sanctions. Instead, they were the third country to sign up. They've realized what they need to do in the long run. They've found a security sponsor. They're paying us to remain interested. Well, Ukraine controls 1.5 of those gateways. So that's specifically what they're after here. With a lot of the other interventions in the past, whether it's in Georgia in 2004, Crimea in 2014, Nagorno-Karabakh last year, Kazakhstan this January, that allowed the Russians to get boots on the ground in many of these gateways. If they capture Ukraine in its total, they will now, or would, have access to 7 of them. You're getting pretty close to what they consider success. Yeah, I mean, none of the sanctions that are in place are enough to whap the Russians up the side of the head and give a second thought. But I am quite pleased that the West is not dead. We haven't been able to get NATO to agree to anything of substance, in my opinion, since 1987. And to have the strictest sanctions in human history in place, to have the Russian central bank shut off from all financial avenues, it can't access dollars or euros or yen or Aussie dollars or Swiss francs, even ones that they own are now beyond them. That is an amazing agreement. Like I said, it's not enough. The only sanction that the Europeans might have been able to do that would have made Putin blink heavily would have been just to say we will never buy any Russian oil and natural gas ever again.
Could they even do that, though?
Not without a lot of pain.
Yeah.
The Russians, based on which country you're talking, on average, it's 40% of their energy needs. And so if you were to get by without 40% of the energy you needed for the next year, your life would look very, very different. So I understand why the Europeans are trying to have their cake and eat it too, but it's not going to last. There is no way you have a war in a country as large as Ukraine, with as much infrastructure as Ukraine, and with the tactics that the Russians are going to have to use, and that energy is still going to flow. So one way or another this year, probably in the next few weeks, those energy flows are going to shut off anyway. That's not how they think of things. Russians pride themselves to a degree on privation, and the sort of people who would push back against the government are the kind that are eating the imported cheese. They're not the kind of people that are going to pick up a soldier and march, or pick up a weapon and march on Red Square. You're talking about the pro-Western elites, the more educated people, and those people are now trying to find a way out. And from Putin's point of view, he sees them as a net loss, so that's really not a problem.
Right, but there's
he sees their departure as a net win. I said that back. All that's left is, I don't have the numbers firmly committed, I think it's about 120 billion in gold. That is of no use in domestic management. And then like 60 billion in yuan, which is yuan that the Chinese don't want back. So they're already there. They're already scraping metal. They're built domestically. It's entirely possible that they will find that they have some components or some weapon systems that they didn't adequately prepare for, and that will turn the war into more of a slog. But the Russians have 10 times the army that the Ukrainians do, and as so long as no one else launches an invasion of Russia proper or sends regular troops into Ukraine, they will win this. But the Russians have done this off and on for 70 years. And so all the people in the West who nuclear policy is a responsibility, they all perked up. They all looked at it very, very closely, and they're like, okay, nothing's really changed.